I was holding his belt when his trousers dropped, showing more than I expected. Clara held her breath as Leo raced to pull his trousers back up, his face becoming scarlet. His expression was a combination of disbelief and humiliation. "I'm terribly sorry, Aunt Clara." He stuttered in his voice. "Trembling." Clara hastily looked away, her pulse racing in her chest. "Leo, what on earth just happened?" She demanded, her tone sharper than intended. "It's the buckle," he mumbled, fumbling with his belt again. "It's broken." "I thought you could help me fix it." Her initial irritation softened as she turned back to face him. He was standing there, awkwardly clutching the belt around his waist like a shield. "Let me see," she said, motioning for him to come closer. Leo hesitated before stepping forward, his gaze avoiding hers. She grabbed the belt in her hands, attempting to concentrate on the work rather than the uneasiness that hung in the air. But when her fingers brushed across his, a weird tension formed between them, subtle but difficult to ignore. She re-Henried after a minute, her voice softer, that it should hold for the time being. Leo nodded, still avoiding her eyes. "Thanks," he muttered, turning to leave, but before he could step out, he paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Aunt Clara." Yes, her voice carried a note of apprehension. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then shook his head. "Never mind," he said softly, before slipping out of the room as the door clicked shut. Clara leaned against the dresser, her pulse racing the image of his panicked face, the unspoken tension in the air. It all lingered in her mind, refusing to fade what happens next. We'll leave you guessing. Don't miss the next part of this story. Like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more twists. Clara couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. She tried to distract herself by tidying up her room, but her thoughts kept circling back to that moment. The tension in Leo's voice, the way he'd looked at her, it wasn't something she could easily dismiss. Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet hum, there was another knock at her door. This time it was louder, more deliberate. She hesitated before opening it, half expecting Leo to be standing there again. And there he was, hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking like a lost little boy, despite his towering frame. "Leo," she said cautiously, "is everything okay? He trailed off his eyes, darting around the room as if searching for the right words. "I wanted to apologize for earlier. I didn't mean to make things weird." Clara crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You didn't make things weird. It was just unexpected, that's all." He let out a nervous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, unexpected. That's one way to put it." There was a pause, a silence so thick it seemed to press against them both. Clara felt the weight of his stare and the passion behind it, which made her stomach churn in ways she couldn't describe. "You're a nice child, Leo," she whispered quietly, breaking the pause. "Do not overthink it." He took a step closer, his visage changing into something she couldn't read. "I'm not a child, Aunt Clara." His voice was low and steady. Clara's breath caught, and the room seemed smaller and the air heavier. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The moment stretched out, charged and fragile, until Leo finally broke it by stepping back goodnight. He murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, before he turned and disappeared down the hallway. Clara closed the door and leaned her forehead against it, her heart pounding. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The tension, the strange connection she'd felt earlier, it was wrong, forbidden. And yet she shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away, but deep down she knew this wasn't. Over the next morning, Clara tried to shake off the unsettling thoughts from the night before. She busied herself with chores, keeping her mind occupied, but every so often she'd catch herself replaying Leo's words, "I'm not a kid." The weight of his statement lingered like a shadow, refusing to let her move on. As she stood in the kitchen preparing lunch, the sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. She didn't have to turn around to know it was him. She could feel his presence. The air around her charged and heavy, need help with anything. Leo's voice was casual, but there was an edge to it, something she couldn't quite place. She forced a smile and glanced over her shoulder. I'm fine, but thanks for asking. Leo leaned against the counter, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You've been avoiding me, he said bluntly. Clara faltered, nearly dropping the knife she was holding. I'm not avoiding you, she replied quickly, though her voice betrayed her. I've just been busy avoiding me, he said. With a smirk, his tone teasing, but his eyes serious. Clara sighed, turning to face him fully. Leo, about last night. You don't have to say it, he interrupted, stepping closer. I get it. It was awkward, and I probably made it worse. But he hesitated, his gaze locking onto hers. It wasn't just awkward, was it her here? He thudded painfully in her chest. Leo, don't. She whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't. What? He tilted his head, his expression softening. Say what we're both thinking. Pretend nothing happened. I can't do that. Leo, this is wrong, he finished for her. Yeah, I know, but that doesn't change how I feel. Clara took a shaky step back, gripping the edge of the counter. For support. This has to stop. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, it has to stop. Leo's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue, but then he nodded, a flicker of something hurt crossing his face. Okay, he said softly, if that's what you want. He turned and went away, leaving Clara standing there, her head racing and her emotions twisted up. She assured herself that she had done the right thing, so why did it feel so wrong? What happens when sentiments cannot be ignored? Don't miss the next installment. Share and subscribe to follow this unfolding story. The tension in the home became intolerable as the days passed. Clara and Leo barely spoke, each avoiding the other's gaze as if eye contact alone could ignite something dangerous. Clara tried to convince herself that time would smooth over whatever had happened, but deep down she knew it wasn't that simple. Late one evening, as the house settled into a heavy silence, Clara sat alone in the living room with a glass of wine. The dim lighting and soft hum of the television did little to calm her restless thoughts. She startled when she heard a quiet knock on the doorframe. Leo stood there, his hair tousled and his expression unreadable. Can I come in? He asked. Softly, Clara hesitated but nodded, setting her glass down. Of course. Leo stepped inside, his movement slow, deliberate. He sank into the chair opposite her, his eyes meeting hers in a way that made her feel exposed. I need to say something. He began. Hi. His voice steady but low. Leo, we don't need to. No, he said, shaking his head. We do because I can't keep pretending things aren't occurring. Clara's stomach tightened. What isn't happening here? He whispered, waving between them. You feel it too, don't you? Clara turned aside as her throat tightened. Leo, you are imagining things. This is not the time to quit lying to yourself, he continued, leaning forcefully forward. It's not just me. I notice how you glance at me when you believe I am not paying attention. I feel it every time we're in the same room, Leo. Stop. She whispered, her voice trembling while he challenged his eyes, searching hers. Because it's wrong. Because you're afraid of what people would think. Or because you're afraid of how much you want it. Clara stood abruptly pacing the room as her emotions threatened to spill over. You're crossing a line, she said, her voice sharp but unsteady. Maybe he admitted standing as well, but some lines are meant to be crossed. His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. Clara turned to face him, her heart pounding as he closed the distance between them. Tell me to leave, he said softly, his gaze locking onto hers, and I will. But if you don't, then stop running from this. Clara's breath sent her thoughts into a swirl of uncertainty and conflict. She wanted to tell him to go so that this could be over for good, but the words wouldn't come. Leo took another step forward, his hand hanging near hers but not quite touching. Say the word. Clara. He muttered. The room seemed like it was closing in on her, and the weight of her own emotions suffocated her. yet she couldn't deny the attraction between them. As dangerous and forbidden as it was, the air in the room seemed to thicken every second, stretching endlessly. As Clara and Leo stood frozen in their unspoken battle, Clara's mind screamed for her to step back to break whatever spell had tethered her to the moment. But her feet stayed rooted in place, her breath shallow and unsteady. "I can't do this," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Leo's expression softened, his intense gaze replaced by something almost tender. "You think I don't understand how you feel, but denying it won't make it go away." She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield her from the storm brewing inside her. "This isn't right, Leo, you know that." "And yet here we are," he replied, his voice steady but not unkind as he spoke. The soft hum of the television filled the silence between his words, an almost mocking reminder of normalcy, amidst the chaos of her emotions. Leo took a careful step forward, his proximity sending a shiver down Clara's spine. "Would you want me to leave?" he inquired, his voice calm yet forceful. Clara gulped hard, her lips dry. Her intellect urged her to say yes, to put a stop to this for good, but her emotions told her otherwise. Her heart felt significantly less confident. When she did not answer, Leo extended out his fingers and brushed across her arm. The touch was light, almost invisible, yet it caused a shock throughout her body. "You don't need to say anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I need you to know that I see you. Not just the woman everyone else sees, but the one who's lonely, who feels invisible. I see you. Clara." Her breath hitched, and for a moment she couldn't look away. It was as though he'd stripped away all the layers she'd carefully built around herself, leaving her raw and exposed. She started, but the words caught in her throat. Leo closed the remaining distance between them, his hand sliding gently down her arm until it reached hers. His touch was warm, grounding, and yet it made her feel as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice. "I'm not asking for forever," he murmured, his voice low and earnest just this moment. The weight of his words pressed against her, filling the room with an unbearable tension. Clara's heart raced as 100 thoughts and emotions collided within her. Finally, she took a step back, her movements jerky and uncertain. "Leo, I can't," she said, her voice trembling. But even as she said it, there was a part of her, small but insistent, that didn't want him to stop. Leo nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I understand," he said quietly, though there was a hint of something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He turned to leave his footsteps heavy as he made his way to the door. But before he could step out, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "This isn't over, Clara," he said softly. "Not unless you want it to be." And with that, he was gone, leaving Clara standing alone in the dimly lit room. Her emotions, a tangled mess. What will Clara do next? Will she succumb to the temptation or find a way to resist? Stay tuned to find out, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next gripping chapter. The silence in the room was deafening after Leo's departure, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. Clara stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. Unable to shake the feeling that she just crossed a line she couldn't uncross, she sank into the armchair, her head falling into her hands as she tried to steady her breathing. The memory of Leo's touch lingered, as did his words, echoing in her mind like a haunting melody. But even in her turmoil, Clara couldn't ignore the pull. She felt it was maddening, overwhelming, and utterly impossible to deny. Just as she began to gather her thoughts, there was a soft knock at the door. She froze, her pulse quickening. "Clara," Leo's voice was quiet, hesitant. She didn't respond, torn between pretending she wasn't there and facing him again. But before she could decide, the door creaked open and he stepped inside. "I forgot my phone," he said, holding up the forgotten device with a sheepish smile. But his eyes betrayed him. He hadn't come back for a phone. Clara straightened her gaze, locking with his. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. though her voice lacked conviction. I know, Leo admitted, stepping closer, but I couldn't leave things like that. She stood, her hands trembling at her sides. Leo, this has to stop. Whatever this thing is between us, it's not right. He closed the distance between them in a few measured steps, his presence overwhelming. Tell me you don't feel it too. He challenged, his voice low and filled with urgency. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The T Clara was she didn't know what she felt anymore. Leo reached out his hand, brushing her cheek. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. His touch was gentle, his gaze steady and searching. You've spent so much of your life doing what's expected of you, he murmured. But what about what you want? Clara, don't you deserve to be happy? Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned away, unable to bear the intensity of his words. I don't know what I want anymore, she said. That is all right, he replied, his voice calm and soothing. Just let yourself feel and stop worrying about what's right or wrong for once. Before she could react, he pressed his lips against hers in a hesitant, lingering kiss. It was hesitant, yet filled with unspoken emotion, a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Clara's mind screamed at her to stop, to push him away, but her body betrayed her, responding to the kiss with an intensity that matched his own. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, their faces inches apart. This changes everything, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Leo nodded, his hand still resting on her cheek. It doesn't have to, he said, unless you want it to. Clara closed her eyes, her mind racing with a million thoughts and possibilities. She knew there was no going back now. Stay, she said. Finally, her voice trembling but resolute. Leo's eyes searched hers for confirmation, and when he saw it, he nodded his hand, slipping down to take hers. As the night stretched on, the weight of their choices hung heavy in the air, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt seen, heard, and alive. The morning sunlight seeped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Clara lay awake with a tempest of emotions in her thoughts. Leo had departed hours before, but the memory of their shared night remained like a thick cloud. As she got out of bed, shame enveloped her, but so did an odd sensation of elation. She couldn't reconcile the two feelings, and every effort to excuse her behavior exacerbated her distress. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Clara stopped breathing when she caught her husband's attention. Henry was not expected back for another 2 days. Who could it be? She approached the door, cautiously peering through the peephole. Her heart sank. As she saw Leo standing there, his expression tense, she opened the door, her voice a whisper. What are you doing here? Leo stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his face pale. We have a problem, he said, his voice trembling. What do you mean? Clara, I scared dread. Creeping into her voice, Leo hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I think someone saw us. The words hit Clara like a slap. What, how, who, I don't know, Leo admitted. But this morning I got a text. He pulled out his phone and handed it to her. The message was brief but chilling. I know what you did. Both of you pay me, or everyone else will know too. Clara's knees buckled and she sank onto the couch. This can't be happening, she murmured. This can't be real. It is, Leo said, his tone sharp, and we need to figure out what to do before this gets out. Clara stared at the message, her mind racing. If word got out, her life, her marriage, her reputation would be over. Did they mention how much she asked? Her voice was barely heard. $10,000. Leo answered, 10,000. Clara repeated, shaking her head. I don't have that much money laying around. Neither do I, Leo admitted. However, if Henry discovers this, we must take action. The mention of her husband's name sent a fresh wave of panic through Clara. She stood abruptly, pacing the room. This is a nightmare, she said. A complete nightmare. We could go to the police, Leo suggested. though his tone was doubtful, and tell them what Clara snapped she couldn't even say it. Leo fell silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. Suddenly, Clara's phone buzzed. She grabbed it instinctively, her hands trembling. Another text had come through TikTok. "The clock is running. Don't make me wait." Her heart pounded as she read the words. The blackmailer wasn't going to give them time to think. "What do we do?" Leo asked, his voice desperate. Clara looked at him, her mind spinning. "We pay them," she said. "Finally, we have no choice." Leo nodded reluctantly. "But how we don't have the money, we'll figure it out," Clara said, though she didn't believe her own words, as they sat in silence plotting their next move. Clara couldn't resist the sensation that this was only the beginning of their nightmare, and she was correct, since none of them realized Henry had gone home early. He stood in the corridor, having heard every word. The door creaked as he pulled it open, walking into the room with a look that sent shivers down Clara's spine. "You both have a lot to explain," Henry stated. His voice sounded dangerously calm. Leo grew pale, and Clara's world fell in an instant. How will Henry react now that he knows the tea, Clara? Can Clara and Leo save their lives? Will their secrets ruin them completely? Remember to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more.